All right, here we go. Writing this is surreal because honestly, I've been sitting on this for over a year, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't think I'd ever need to vent to the internet, but here I am. Maybe sharing it will help me move on, or at least help someone else avoid falling into the same nightmare. My name's Jake, and until last year, I thought I had a pretty solid life. I'm 42, remarried to Lisa, who, for what it's worth, I thought was my soulmate. We've been together for 7 years. I also have a son, Dylan, from my first marriage. Dylan's 17 now, a good kid with a bit of a rebellious streak, but what teenager isn't, right? For most of our marriage, things were smooth. Lisa was warm and supportive, at least she seemed that way. I work a demanding job in logistics, which means a lot of travel. Lisa always said she was fine with it, claiming she enjoyed having her space when I was away. I believed her because, well, why wouldn't I? Last year, I was out on a business trip when the storm hit, literally and metaphorically. While making a routine stop, I had an accident. I slipped on a rusty nail, punctured my leg, and ended up in the hospital for over a month. What was supposed to be a quick trip turned into a nightmare of surgeries and physical therapy. But that wasn't even the worst part. At the time, Lisa was supportive over the phone, checking in daily, sending pictures of herself and Dylan, and telling me to focus on getting better. I missed home, and her sweet messages were the only thing keeping me sane. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was the way she seemed too chipper in her texts, or how her calls always felt rushed. Before my trip, I'd started noticing some red flags. Lisa was dressing up more often, tight dresses, makeup, the works, but she didn't seem interested in going anywhere with me. Then there were the secretive phone calls she'd brush off as girl talk, and the way she suddenly had errands to run late at night. I told myself I was being paranoid, but man, something just didn't sit right. That's when I decided to install cameras in our home. 3 of them, discreetly placed in the bedroom, kitchen, and hallway. It wasn't easy to justify to myself. I felt like a terrible husband for snooping, but part of me just needed peace of mind. I told myself it was a precaution, nothing more. I didn't check the footage right away, even after getting stuck in the hospital. I trusted Lisa to handle things at home and to be there for Dylan. But when my discharge got delayed and she suddenly became less responsive, I had to know if my gut feeling meant something or if I was just losing it. Little did I know that decision would change everything. Stay tuned. What I found in those recordings was worse than anything I could have imagined. All right, so here's where things really start unraveling. After weeks in the hospital, I finally got some downtime to check the footage. I was nervous. I mean, who actually wants to confirm their worst suspicions? But Lisa had been distant lately, and I just couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I opened the app on my phone late one night while I was lying in my hospital bed. My palms were sweaty as I scrolled through days of recordings. At first, everything seemed normal. Lisa moving around the house, cooking in the kitchen, chatting on the phone in the hallway. But then I noticed a pattern. Every day around 3 p.m., Dylan would get home from school, and Lisa would act weird, like over-the-top cheerful, almost flirty. I chalked it up to her trying to connect with him. Stepmom stuff? You know? But then, one day, I saw her wearing a robe when he came home. Not just any robe. My robe. The one she never wore unless she was trying to get my attention. That alone made my stomach churn. Then, about a week into the recordings, I saw something that froze me. Lisa and Dylan were in the kitchen, laughing about something. She leaned in to grab something off the counter, and Dylan put his hand on her lower back, not in a casual, family way. Lisa didn't flinch. She didn't tell him to stop. She just smiled. I felt like my heart stopped right then and there. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was misinterpreting things. But the next video killed any doubts I had. It was a Friday afternoon. Dylan had just gotten home from school, and Lisa was waiting for him in the bedroom. The same bedroom where she and I shared everything for the past 7 years. She wasn't in a robe this time. She was in lingerie. Lingerie I'd bought for her as an anniversary gift. I couldn't watch. My hands were trembling so hard I nearly dropped my phone. But I forced myself to press play again. What followed confirmed everything I didn't want to believe. She was waiting for him, and he walked in like he owned the place. The way they interacted, laughing, whispering, was like a twisted version of intimacy I never thought I'd witness in my life. It wasn't just physical. They were comfortable, familiar. The timestamps told me it had been going on for at least a month. A whole month of betrayal while I was stuck in a hospital bed, trusting her to hold down the fort at home. I felt sick. My chest hurt. My entire body felt like it was on fire. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something far worse. My wife. My son. How do you even process something like that? I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind raced with a million questions, none of which had answers. How could Lisa do this? Why would Dylan even go along with it? Had my entire life been a lie? By the time the sun came up, one thing was clear. I needed to get out of the hospital and go home. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't let this continue for another second. Leaving the hospital felt surreal. I should have been relieved to be out, but instead, I was gripped by this gnawing dread. I couldn't even look at the nurses as they handed me my discharge papers. I just wanted to get home, to face Lisa and Dylan, to figure out how to even begin untangling the mess I'd uncovered. My leg was still healing, so walking was slow and awkward. A coworker, Mike, drove me home. He kept chatting about how glad he was that I was recovering and how work wasn't the same without me, but all I could manage were polite nods. My mind was elsewhere, replaying those awful videos on a loop. I hadn't told a soul what I'd discovered. Not even Mike, who's one of my closest friends. How could I? The shame, the betrayal, it was too big to put into words. When we pulled up to the house, everything looked normal. The lawn was freshly mowed. The porch light was on. It was the same house I'd come back to 1,000 times before, but now it felt alien. Like I didn't belong there anymore. Need help with your bag? Mike offered, pointing to my overnight duffel. Nah, I got it. Thanks, man. I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded, waved, and drove off. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the front door, my chest tight. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew nothing would be the same after today. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Lisa was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. She looked up surprised. "Jake, you're home early," she exclaimed, rushing over to give me a hug. I froze. The smell of her perfume, normally comforting, made my stomach turn. She pulled back, frowning. "Are you okay? You look pale." I forced a smile. "You're just tired. Long drive?" She hesitated for a moment, studying my face, then smiled again. "Well, it's good to have you back. Dinner's almost ready. Dylan should be home soon." Dylan should be home soon. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I nodded and muttered something about needing to lie down, then limped down the hallway to the bedroom. The very room where it had all gone down. It looked the same as always, clean, cozy, our wedding photo still sitting on the nightstand. But it felt tainted now, like every piece of furniture was mocking me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my mind spinning. I could hear Lisa moving around in the kitchen, her footsteps light and cheerful. She had no idea that her little secret was about to implode. I didn't have a plan yet. Part of me wanted to storm into the kitchen, throw the evidence in her face, and demand answers. Another part of me wanted to pack a bag and leave without saying a word. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let this slide. Not with Dylan involved. Not with the betrayal so raw and unforgivable. As I sat there, the sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my thoughts. Dylan was home. His voice echoed through the hallway as he greeted Lisa. They sounded normal, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. This was it. It was time to confront them. But how? Sitting on the edge of that bed, listening to Dylan and Lisa laughing in the kitchen, I felt like a bomb about to go off. I knew I couldn't just sit there pretending everything was fine. The longer I waited, the worse it would get. I stood up, grabbed my phone, the one with all the recorded evidence, and limped toward the kitchen. My leg throbbed with every step, but the pain felt distant, drowned out by the storm in my head. When I turned the corner, there they were. Lisa was stirring something on the stove, while Dylan leaned against the counter, eating a piece of apple she'd cut for him. They looked so casual, so comfortable. It was like I was the intruder in my own home. "Hey, Dad," Dylan said, his grin wide and easy. Good to see you back. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I just stood there looking at them. Lisa noticed the tension and tilted her head. Jake, you all right? She asked, her voice full of fake concern. No, I said, my voice low but firm. I'm not all right. Lisa froze, the spoon in her hand hovering midair. Dylan's smile faltered. What's wrong? Lisa asked, her tone shifting to cautious. What's wrong? I repeated, my voice rising. I held up my phone, my hand trembling. How about the fact that I know everything? Lisa's eyes darted to the phone, and for a split second, I saw something flash in her expression. Panic. Fear. Then she plastered on that fake, innocent smile I'd grown to hate. What are you talking about? Don't. I snapped, my voice cracking. Don't play dumb with me, Lisa. I installed cameras before I left. I've seen the videos. Her face went pale. Videos? What videos? She stammered, but her voice betrayed her. Dylan, on the other hand, stood there looking genuinely confused. Dad, what's going on? I turned to him, my chest tight. How was I supposed to explain this? How could I even say the words? I know about you and Lisa, I said, my voice heavy with disgust. I've seen what you two have been doing. Dylan's face twisted in confusion. What? What are you talking about? Lisa cut in before I could answer. Jake, stop. This is insane. You're tired and stressed. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what it looks like. Her voice was shaking now, her eyes darting between me and Dylan. She was trying to keep her cool, but the cracks were showing. Not what it looks like. I barked. Are you seriously going to stand there and deny it? I saw you, Lisa. I saw everything. You and Dylan, in our bedroom, in our kitchen. Don't insult me by pretending I'm imagining things. Dylan's face went from confusion to horror. Wait. What? He said, stepping back like he'd been slapped. You think Dad know? That's not. He looked at Lisa, his face twisting with disbelief. Lisa, what's he talking about? Lisa's composure shattered. She threw the spoon into the sink and turned to me, her voice shrill. Are you really doing this, Jake? In front of him? You're going to accuse me of something so disgusting. Cut the crap, I yelled, my voice echoing off the walls. You think I don't have proof? I watched you, Lisa. I heard you. Stop lying to my face. The room went silent. Dylan's hands were shaking now, his voice breaking. Lisa, tell him he's wrong. Tell him this isn't true. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone caught with no way out. Dylan's expression changed. Oh my God, he whispered, stepping away from her. You actually did this? His voice cracked, disbelief turning into anger. Lisa's voice rose in desperation. It's not what you think. He's twisting things. Jake's been paranoid for months. Paranoid? I shouted, stepping closer. You think this is about paranoia? You've been sleeping with my son while I was stuck in a hospital bed. You've destroyed everything, Lisa. Everything. Dylan's face contorted with rage. You used me, he hissed, his voice shaking. You manipulated me. He turned to me, tears in his eyes. Dad, I didn't know how to stop her. I swear. Lisa lunged toward him, her voice panicked. No, don't say that. It wasn't like that. You wanted this too. I stepped between them, my blood boiling. Don't you dare blame him. I roared. You're the adult. You're his stepmother. For God's sake. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Dylan bolted for the door, his face a mess of emotions. Lisa tried to follow, but I blocked her path. You're not going anywhere, I growled. We're not done. She looked at me, her face twisted in desperation. Jake, please. Save it, I spat. You've already said enough. And just like that, the illusion of our perfect little family shattered completely. The door slammed behind Dylan, leaving Lisa and me alone in the kitchen. The air was thick with tension, the silence, so sharp it felt like it could cut through steel. For a moment, neither of us moved. Lisa just stood there, trembling, her face pale as if all the blood had drained from it. I wanted to yell, to throw something, to do anything to release the anger boiling inside me. But instead, I just stood there, staring at her. "Explain," I finally said, my voice low and cold. Lisa's lips trembled. She looked like she was about to cry, but I wasn't buying it. "Jake, I don't know what to say," she stammered, her hands wringing together. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare give me that it just happened garbage. You seduced my son. You betrayed me in the worst possible way. How the hell do you even begin to explain something like that?" She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over now. "I was lonely," she said, her voice breaking. "You were gone so much, Jake. You were in the hospital for weeks, and I just felt so empty. Dylan was here, and he listened to me. He was there when you weren't. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously blaming me for this?" I shouted. "You're trying to make your disgusting, manipulative behavior about me not being around enough?" She reached out to me, but I took a step back, repulsed. "Jake, please," she sobbed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear, I never wanted to hurt you." "Go this far?" I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. "So, what was the plan, Lisa? To keep sneaking around behind my back? To keep destroying whatever shred of trust one had left?" Lisa's sobs turned to desperation. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't plan this. It just happened. That was it." I couldn't listen to another word. "Stop saying it just happened," I roared, slamming my hand down on the counter so hard it made her jump. "You had choices, Lisa. 100 opportunities to stop. But you didn't, did you? You let it happen. You encouraged it." She broke down completely then, sinking to her knees on the kitchen floor, her hands covering her face. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating. "I'm so sorry." I didn't feel sorry for her. Not one bit. All I could think about was Dylan. How he must have felt, caught up in this mess, manipulated by someone he should have been able to trust. I'd failed him as a father by bringing Lisa into his life. That guilt weighed heavier on me than anything else. "You're not sorry," I said coldly. "You're just sorry you got caught." Her crying didn't stop, but I couldn't deal with it anymore. I turned and limped out of the kitchen, leaving her there in a heap on the floor. I needed to find Dylan. He was my priority now. Grabbing my phone, I called him. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. Panic started to creep in. He was just a kid, and this whole thing had blown up in his face. He'd never been one to handle pressure well, and I hated the idea of him being out there alone, with no one to talk to. I sent him a text. "Dylan, please come home. We need to talk. I'm not angry at you. Just come back, son. Please." No response. I felt helpless, standing there in the hallway with my phone in hand, waiting for a reply that might never come. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Lisa's betrayal anymore. Dylan was my son, and I needed to make sure he was okay, even if it meant putting my own pain aside for now. Back in the kitchen, Lisa was still crying, but I ignored her. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door. If Dylan wasn't going to come home, I'd find him myself. Driving around town, I felt like I was on autopilot. My mind was a chaotic mess, bouncing between anger, guilt, and worry. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a message from Dylan, but there was nothing. The streets blurred past as I mentally ran through all the places he might go. First, I swung by his friend Jake's house. Yeah, my son's best friend has the same name as me. Convenient, huh? Jake's mom answered the door, looking concerned when I asked if Dylan was there. "No, I haven't seen him," she said, her tone soft but curious. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah, just a bit of an argument at home. I'll track him down," I replied, forcing a smile. I drove to the park next. Dylan used to hang out there when he wanted space to clear his head. Sure enough, his car was parked near the basketball courts. Relief washed over me as I pulled up beside it, but when I got out, Dylan wasn't anywhere in sight. "Come on, kid," I muttered, scanning the area. Then I spotted him, sitting on a bench near the lake, hunched over with his head in his hands. My stomach twisted at the sight. He looked so small, so defeated. For a moment, I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? How could I even begin to fix this? I approached slowly, trying not to startle him. "Dylan," I called softly. He looked up, his face streaked with tears. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I just want to talk," I said, sitting down next to him. "I need to know you're okay." He let out a bitter laugh. "Okay? How the hell could I be okay after all this?" I didn't blame him for snapping at me. "I know," I said quietly. It's beyond messed up, but I need you to understand something. You're not at fault here. None of this is your fault." He shook his head, his hands gripping his hair. "I should have stopped it. I knew it was wrong, but his voice broke. She made me feel like I couldn't say no, like I owed her something." My chest tightened, the anger I felt toward Lisa boiling over again. "Dylan, listen to me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "What she did was manipulate you. She took advantage of your trust, and that's on her, not you. You're just a kid. She's the adult. She's the one who's supposed to know better." He sniffed, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I didn't want to hurt you, Dad. I didn't know how to tell you. You should have never been put in that position in the first place," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. I should have been there for you. I should have protected you from all of this." For a moment, we just sat there, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and the distant hum of traffic. I put a hand on his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, looking out at the water. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this, we're going to get through it. Together. I'm not letting her destroy this family any more than she already has." Dylan nodded slowly, the tension in his posture easing just a bit. "I don't want to go back home. I can't be around her." "You don't have to," I said firmly. "We'll figure something out. For now, why don't you come with me? We can grab some food, clear our heads." He hesitated, then nodded again. "Yeah, okay." It wasn't much, but it was a start. As we walked back to the car, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Dylan and I were far from okay, but at least now we were on the same page. Whatever came next, I knew I had to be strong, for both of us. After grabbing some burgers at a drive-thru, Dylan and I headed to a cheap motel on the edge of town. I didn't want him stepping foot back in that house until I figured out what to do about Lisa. As we ate in silence, the motel room felt sterile and lifeless, but at least it was neutral ground. No reminders of the chaos waiting at home. Dylan pushed his fries around the tray, barely touching his food. "What are you going to do about Lisa?" he finally asked, not meeting my eyes. I sighed, leaning back against the headboard of the bed. "First thing tomorrow. I'm filing for divorce." His head snapped up, his eyes wide. "You mean it?" "Of course I do," I said firmly. "What she's done is beyond repair. There's no fixing this, Dylan. She's out of our lives, period." For the first time that night, I saw a flicker of relief cross his face. "Good," he muttered. "She doesn't deserve to be part of this family." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "And I'm pressing charges if I can. What she did to you, what she did to us, there's no walking away from that without consequences." Dylan didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease a little. I couldn't imagine what he was feeling, having been manipulated like that by someone he trusted. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a violation of everything a family should stand for. That night, as Dylan slept in the other bed, I lay awake scrolling through my phone. I revisited the recordings, as much as it made my stomach churn, carefully saving every file to a secure drive. I needed the evidence, not just for the divorce, but for whatever legal action I could pursue. I also reached out to my lawyer, Frank. I didn't care that it was late. I left him a detailed voicemail explaining the situation. "Frank, I need you to call me first thing in the morning," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "This isn't just a divorce. There's more going on here. Something criminal. I'll send you the evidence. We need to act fast." As I hung up, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to the situation, I was taking control. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it wasn't peaceful. My dreams were a jumbled mess of anger, betrayal, and regret. But when I woke up the next morning to the sound of Dylan stirring, I knew I had no choice but to keep moving forward. "Let's head out," I said, tossing him a hoodie. We got a lot to take care of today. The first stop was the courthouse. I felt a wave of nerves as I walked in, but I didn't let it show. Dylan stayed in the car while I filed the paperwork for divorce, explaining the situation to the clerk with as much detail as I could stomach. I left nothing out. Lisa's actions were reprehensible, and I wanted the court to know exactly what kind of person she was. Next, I headed to the police station. I wasn't sure how far I'd get, but I had to try. After a brief conversation with an officer, I handed over the evidence, the videos, the texts, everything. I explained the manipulation, how she had coerced Dylan, how she'd violated every boundary of decency. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. "This is serious," he said, his tone grave. "We'll need to investigate further, but based on what you've shown me, there's definitely a case here." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Lisa wasn't just going to get away with this. When I got back to the car, Dylan looked at me expectantly. "What did they say?" "They're taking it seriously," I said, keeping my tone calm. "It's going to take time, but they'll investigate. And I've filed for divorce, so that's already in motion." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, Dad." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "We're going to be okay, Dylan. I promise." It wasn't the end, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally heading in the right direction. By the time we got back to town, my lawyer Frank had called me back. He was as shocked as I'd expected, but he was also all business. "Jake, this is serious," he said over the phone. "Filing for divorce is the right move, but you need to be prepared for her to fight back, especially if she thinks she's losing everything." "Let her fight," I replied, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "She's not winning this." Frank agreed to fast-track the paperwork and advised me to avoid direct confrontation with Lisa for now. But avoidance wasn't an option. I needed to make it clear to her that this was over, and that Dylan and I were done being her victims. When Dylan and I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Lisa's car was gone. I wasn't surprised. She probably ran off to clear her head or, to be honest, figure out how to cover her tracks. Fine by me. It gave me time to pack her things. "Stay in the car," I told Dylan as I got out. He didn't argue. I could see in his eyes that he had no interest in stepping foot inside that house. Walking into the house felt strange, like stepping into a crime scene. The smell of Lisa's perfume still lingered, and her things were scattered everywhere. Her purse on the counter, her shoes by the door. It was all so familiar, but now it made my skin crawl. I went straight to the bedroom and grabbed a suitcase from the closet. It was petty, but I started with her favorite things. The dresses she loved, the expensive makeup I'd bought her for Christmas, the shoes she'd always worn to date nights with me. One by one, I shoved them into the bag without care. Halfway through packing, I heard the front door slam. My pulse spiked, and I turned to see Lisa storming into the bedroom, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Packing your things," I replied evenly, zipping up the suitcase. "You're not staying here." Her mouth fell open, and for a moment, she looked genuinely stunned. "Jake, you can't be serious. This is our house." "Not anymore," I said, brushing past her with the suitcase. "I've already filed for divorce." She followed me, her voice rising with every step. "Divorce? Jake, stop being dramatic. We can work through this. We've been through worse." "Worse?" I snapped, spinning around to face her. "You slept with my son, Lisa. You destroyed this family. You think there's any coming back from that?" Her face twisted, and the fake tears started again. "Jake, I'm sorry. I told you I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake, okay? A horrible mistake, but—" "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "You keep calling it a mistake like you tripped and fell into bed with him. This wasn't a mistake, Lisa. It was a choice, a series of disgusting, selfish choices. And now, you're going to live with the consequences." She tried to grab my arm, but I shook her off. "Please, Jake," she pleaded. "We can fix this. Think about what we had. Think about Dylan. He needs us to stay together." At that, I saw red. "Don't you dare use Dylan to manipulate me," I hissed. "You've done enough damage to him already. He's never going to trust you again, and frankly, neither will I. So pack up the rest of your things and get out. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Where am I supposed to go? She sobbed. Not my problem, I said coldly. You made this bed, Lisa. Now you can lie in it somewhere else. I walked out without another word, slamming the door behind me. Dylan looked up from the passenger seat as I climbed into the car. Is she gone? He asked quietly. Not yet, I admitted, gripping the steering wheel. But she will be. He nodded, staring out the window. Neither of us spoke as I backed out of the driveway. There was nothing left to say. Lisa was out of our lives, one way or another. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her drag us down any further. After leaving the house, Dylan and I spent the night at another motel. Neither of us wanted to go back, not while Lisa was still there. I could tell he was emotionally drained, but so was I. We sat in silence, both of us staring at the muted TV, lost in our own thoughts. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head. Lisa's excuses, Dylan's pain, and my own guilt for not seeing it sooner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those recordings, that smug look on Lisa's face, and the way she treated her betrayal like it was some kind of oops moment. It made my blood boil. Morning came too quickly. Dylan was still asleep when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Frank, my lawyer. Jake, I've reviewed the evidence you sent me. We have a solid case for divorce. I've also flagged this for family court regarding Dylan's safety. Call me when you're ready to discuss next steps. It was exactly the kind of message I needed. I finally felt like things were moving in the right direction. After a quick breakfast, I woke Dylan up and told him we were heading out. Where to? He asked, his voice groggy. Back to the house, I said. She's going to be gone today, whether she likes it or not. Dylan looked uneasy, but didn't argue. He simply nodded and followed me to the car. When we pulled into the driveway, Lisa's car was still there. My jaw tightened. She hadn't listened. I took a deep breath and motioned for Dylan to stay in the car. Inside, I found her in the living room, sipping coffee like it was any other morning. She didn't even look up when I walked in. Lisa, I said, my tone sharp, what are you still doing here? She set her mug down and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Jake, I don't have anywhere to go. Can we just talk about this? There's nothing to talk about, I said firmly. I gave you until this morning to pack your things. If you haven't, then I'll do it for you. Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Please, Jake, she begged. This is my home, too. We've built a life here. I can't just leave. Stop, I snapped, cutting her off. You already left the moment you decided to destroy this family. You lost the right to call this your home when you betrayed me and Dylan. Now pack your things, or I'll call the police to remove you myself. Her expression hardened. You're being cruel, she said, her voice shaking. I let out a bitter laugh. Cruel? You think this is cruel? Cruel is what you did to me. To Dylan. You don't get to play the victim here. She stood there, silent, her face twisted in frustration and anger. Finally, she let out a sigh and stormed off to the bedroom. I followed her to make sure she actually started packing. It was painful, watching her shove her clothes into a bag with tears streaming down her face. There was a time when I would have done anything to comfort her. But now I just wanted her gone. As she packed, I grabbed her spare key off the counter and walked outside. I couldn't stay in there with her any longer. Dylan looked up from the car, his face tense. She's packing, I said, sliding into the driver's seat. It won't be long now. We waited in silence until Lisa finally emerged, her suitcase in tow. She didn't look at either of us as she loaded her things into the car. Before she got in, she turned to me, her expression a mix of desperation and defiance. You'll regret this, Jake, she said, her voice low. No, I replied, meeting her gaze. The only thing I regret is trusting you. She climbed into her car and drove off without another word. Watching her leave should have felt like a victory, but instead, it just felt empty. I turned to Dylan, who was staring at the road where Lisa's car had disappeared. She's gone, I said softly. Good, he muttered, though his voice didn't sound convinced. We both knew this wasn't the end of the fallout. It was only the beginning. But at least now, we could start picking up the pieces, without her. With Lisa gone, the house felt eerily quiet. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every room seemed to echo with the memories of what had happened. Dylan and I walked through the front door together, neither of us saying a word. He headed straight to his room, and I stood in the living room, staring at the space where Lisa had been sitting just hours earlier. I didn't feel relief. Not yet. There was too much damage to process. The first thing I did was grab a trash bag and start clearing out every trace of her. The coffee mug she'd left behind, the blanket she always used on the couch, the framed photo of us on the mantel. All of it went into the bag. It felt petty, but I needed it out of sight. As I cleaned, my phone buzzed. It was Frank. "Jake," he said when I answered, his tone brisk. "I just spoke to the court clerk. The divorce petition has been processed, and a temporary restraining order has been approved." "Restraining order?" I asked, caught off guard. "For Dylan," Frank clarified. "Given the circumstances, the judge agreed it was necessary. Lisa's not allowed within 500 feet of him until this is resolved. You've got full temporary custody." Hearing that was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. At least Dylan would have space to heal without her trying to manipulate him further. "Thanks, Frank," I said, my voice steady. "I appreciate you moving so quickly on this." "It's my job," he replied. "But Jake, this isn't over. Lisa's probably going to lawyer up and fight back. Be prepared." "Let her," I said, the anger bubbling back up. "She's not getting anywhere near Dylan again." After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at my phone. I couldn't help but wonder what Lisa's next move would be. Knowing her, she wouldn't go quietly. Later that evening, I checked on Dylan. He was lying on his bed, headphones on, scrolling through his phone. When I knocked on the door frame, he pulled the headphones off and looked at me. "You okay?" I asked. He shrugged. "I guess." I stepped into the room, sitting on the edge of his desk chair. "Listen, Dylan, I know this has been a lot to deal with, more than anyone should ever have to handle. But I need you to know I'm here for you. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." He nodded but didn't say anything. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the guilt still eating away at him. "What happened wasn't your fault," I said firmly. "I don't care what she told you or how she made you feel. She took advantage of you, and that's on her, not you." His eyes welled up, and he looked away. "I feel so stupid," he whispered. "I should have said something sooner." "Hey," I said, leaning forward. "You're not stupid. You're a kid. She's the one who betrayed us, not you. Don't let her mistakes define how you see yourself." He sniffed, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "It just feels like everything's ruined." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "It does right now, but we'll get through this. It's going to take time, but we'll rebuild. Together." For the first time in days, he gave me a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, after Dylan went to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at my laptop. I opened the folder where I'd saved all the evidence and started organizing it for the next steps with Frank. It was painful to go through, but it reminded me why I was doing this, to protect Dylan, to take back control of our lives. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of determination. Lisa had taken so much from us, but she wasn't going to take anything else. This was my family, my home, and my future, and I was ready to fight for it. The next morning started quietly. Too quietly. I had expected Lisa to try something dramatic, showing up at the house, calling nonstop, maybe even trying to spin her version of events to friends or family. But there had been nothing. No texts, no calls. Just silence. It should have been a relief, but it only made me more anxious. Dylan stayed in his room most of the morning, leaving me to my thoughts. I spent the time making calls, checking in with Frank, confirming the restraining order had been served to Lisa, and starting the process of switching the locks on the house. By the time I finished, I felt drained but productive. And that's when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something about it made my stomach drop. I hesitated before answering. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Jake." It was Lisa. Her voice sounded shaky, like she'd been crying. I clenched the phone tighter. What do you want, Lisa? Please, just hear me out, she said quickly. I know I'm the last person you want to talk to, but I didn't know where else to turn. I didn't respond right away. My instinct was to hang up, but part of me was curious. What could she possibly say now? Turn to? For what? I asked coldly. I lost my job, she stammered. The restraining order. You told them everything, didn't you? About Dylan, about what happened. I didn't answer. She took my silence as confirmation and let out a shaky breath. They fired me, Jake. My boss said they couldn't have someone like me representing the company. And now I have nowhere to go, no one to help me. I felt a flash of anger. She was playing the victim again, twisting the situation to make it about her. That's not my problem, Lisa, I said firmly. You made your choices. You're dealing with the consequences. Don't call me looking for sympathy. But Jake, she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. I'm still your wife. You're not my wife, I snapped. You stopped being my wife the second you betrayed me and my son. This is over, Lisa. You need to accept that. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, colder. You think you're better than me, don't you? No, I said, my voice steady. I think I'm done letting you control this family. Goodbye, Lisa. And with that, I hung up. When I turned around, Dylan was standing in the hallway, his arms crossed. Was that her, he asked. I nodded, slipping my phone into my pocket. Yeah, she got fired. She's looking for sympathy. Good, he muttered, a flicker of satisfaction in his voice. I couldn't help but agree. Lisa's life was falling apart, and for once, it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. But as satisfying as it was to hear about her consequences, I knew this wasn't the end of her attempts to claw her way back into our lives. Still, her desperation gave me an edge. If she thought her world was crumbling now, she had no idea what was coming next. The fallout from Lisa's call lingered in the back of my mind all day. Her desperation was obvious, and I knew it wasn't the last I'd hear from her. But I couldn't let her manipulate me or Dylan anymore. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how much she tried to squirm out of it. Later that afternoon, I met with Frank in his downtown office. I'd sent him every piece of evidence I had, and now it was time to strategize. Frank greeted me with a firm handshake. Jake, I've gone through everything, he said as we sat down. This is a strong case, not just for divorce, but potentially for criminal charges. Have you heard from the police since filing the complaint? Not yet, I replied, folding my hands. But Lisa called me this morning. She knows about the restraining order, and apparently, she's already losing her job over this. Frank raised an eyebrow. That's fast, but it works in our favor. If she's unraveling this quickly, she's less likely to put up a real fight in court. We spent the next hour going over the details of the divorce filing, the restraining order, and how we could protect Dylan moving forward. Frank assured me that the evidence was damning enough to secure full custody. Here's the thing, Frank said, leaning forward. Lisa might not have much left to lose, but that can make her dangerous. She could try to drag this out in court, especially if she thinks it'll give her leverage. Leverage for what? I asked, frowning. Money, Frank replied bluntly. She could push for spousal support, try to paint herself as the victim. It's not uncommon in cases like this. I scoffed. She's not getting a dime from me. Frank nodded. With the evidence we have, she won't. But be prepared for her to try. As I left Frank's office, I felt more confident, but also exhausted. The legal battle ahead was going to be brutal, but at least I had the upper hand. That evening, as I was going through my emails, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Claire, my ex-wife and Dylan's mom. Jake, the email began, Dylan called me earlier. He didn't tell me everything, but he said something serious happened at your house. Is he okay? Do you need help? I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Claire and I had always been civil for Dylan's sake, but we weren't exactly close. Still, the fact that Dylan had reached out to her made me realize just how shaken he must be. I quickly typed a response. Claire, thanks for checking in. Dylan's been through a lot, but he's safe now. I can't go into details over email, but it's bad. I'm handling it legally, and I'll make sure Dylan is protected. I appreciate your support. Her reply came almost immediately. Jake, if there's anything I can do, anything at all, let me know. I want to make sure Dylan knows he's not alone in this. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. For all our differences, Claire genuinely cared about Dylan, and I was grateful for that. Maybe her support would help him heal, even if it meant opening a door to the past I wasn't entirely comfortable with. The next day, I brought up Claire's email to Dylan. He was sitting at the kitchen table, poking at a bowl of cereal. Hey, I heard you called your mom, I said, keeping my tone casual. He glanced up, then quickly looked back down. Yeah, I needed to talk to someone. That's fine, I said. She emailed me. She wants to help, if you're okay with that. Dylan hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. I don't know yet. No pressure, I said. Just know she's there if you need her. For the first time in days, Dylan seemed a little less weighed down. If having his mom back in the picture gave him some sense of stability, I wasn't going to stand in the way. As the days went on, things started falling into place. The locks on the house were changed, Frank filed more paperwork, and the police finally reached out to let me know they'd opened an investigation into Lisa's actions. But the battle wasn't over yet. I could feel it in my gut. Lisa wasn't going to go quietly. I just had to make sure Dylan and I were ready for whatever she threw at us next. The IT didn't take long for Lisa to make her next move. Less than a week after she left, I got a notice in the mail. It was from a lawyer. Hers. She was contesting the divorce, claiming she'd been unfairly forced out of her home, and that my actions were emotionally abusive. The sheer audacity of it left me fuming. She destroyed our family, manipulated my son, and now she was painting herself as the victim? It was like she was living in an alternate reality. I called Frank immediately. Got your email, he said when he picked up. Don't worry about this. Her claims are baseless. We have the evidence to shut this down. What's her angle? I asked, pacing the kitchen. Desperation, Frank replied. She knows she's in a losing position. This is a scare tactic, trying to force a settlement before the court sees the full picture. Well, it's not working, I said firmly. We're not settling. Frank reassured me that he'd take care of the response, but the encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth. Lisa wasn't going to stop until she'd milked this situation for every ounce of sympathy or leverage she could get. That afternoon, I picked Dylan up from school. He'd insisted on going back, saying he needed some normalcy, but I could tell the strain was getting to him. As he slid into the passenger seat, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. Rough day? I asked. Yeah, he muttered. Some kids were talking about it. I guess their parents heard rumors or something. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What did they say? Just stuff, he said, staring out the window. That my stepmom's crazy. That our family's messed up. They don't know anything, but it's like everyone's watching me now. My heart broke for him. Dylan had been through enough without dealing with school gossip. I'm sorry, I said. This isn't fair to you. He shrugged, but his voice was tight. It's not your fault. It's hers. She ruined everything. I didn't argue. He was right. Later that evening, as I was going through some paperwork, I got another call from Lisa. Against my better judgment, I answered. Jake, she started, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this to me? I sighed, already exhausted by the conversation. Doing what, Lisa? Holding you accountable for your actions? Protecting my son from you? You're turning him against me, she snapped. He's my family too, Jake. I made a mistake, but I don't deserve to be treated like this. A mistake? I barked, my anger boiling over. You think manipulating my son and betraying me is just a mistake? You're lucky I'm not pressing for even harsher charges. She went silent for a moment. Then her tone shifted, colder, more calculated. If you keep pushing me out, I'll fight for custody, Jake. Dylan's my stepson, and the court might see it differently than you think. Her words sent a chill down my spine. She didn't have a case. Frank had assured me of that. But the fact that she was even threatening it made my blood boil. You won't win, I said through gritted teeth. And if you try, all you'll do is make this worse for yourself. She didn't reply, just hung up. That night, I told Frank about the call. Can she actually try for custody? I asked, my voice tense. Technically, yes, Frank admitted. But with the restraining order in place and the evidence we have, it's unlikely she'd get far. Still, we need to be prepared for her to drag this out. Prepared. That was all I could do. Stay ready, stay strong, and keep fighting. For Dylan. For our future. Lisa was clawing for control, but the more she pushed, the more determined I became to make sure she never hurt us again. The day of the first court hearing arrived faster than I expected. I spent the night before pacing the house, going over every detail with Frank, double-checking the files and evidence. Dylan stayed in his room, quiet but clearly anxious. I wanted to reassure him, but the truth was I didn't know how this would play out. That morning, Dylan didn't go to school. He insisted on coming to the courthouse with me, saying he wanted to hear what was said about him. I told him he didn't have to, but he wouldn't budge. I need to be there, he said firmly. So there we were, sitting side by side in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting for the session to start. My leg bounced with nervous energy, and I kept glancing at Dylan, who was staring at the floor. Finally, the doors opened, and the bailiff called us in. Lisa was already there, sitting with her lawyer. She looked different, polished, professional, almost like she was trying to play the part of the wronged wife. But when she turned and saw Dylan with me, her composure faltered. We sat across from her, and I could feel Dylan tense beside me. I put a hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance that we were in this together. The judge, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, entered, and the room fell silent. The first part of the hearing was procedural, confirming the restraining order, addressing the divorce filing, and laying out the schedule for the case. But then Lisa's lawyer stood up, and the real fight began. "Your Honor," he started, his voice smooth and practiced, "my client has been unfairly vilified in this situation. She acknowledges that mistakes were made, but she has been painted as a danger to her stepson without proper evidence. We believe the restraining order is an overreach and request that it be lifted immediately." I felt Dylan stiffen beside me, and I clenched my fists under the table. Frank stood up next, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, we have provided the court with ample evidence supporting the restraining order. This is not a case of misunderstanding or exaggeration. My client has recordings, text messages, and witness accounts that demonstrate a clear pattern of manipulative and inappropriate behavior by the respondent." The judge glanced at Lisa, her expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said slowly. "It's compelling. However, I'd like to hear directly from the parties involved. Mr. Williams," she turned to me, "would you like to address the court?" I nodded, standing up. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't about vengeance or anger. This is about protecting my son. Lisa manipulated and betrayed both of us in ways that I can't even fully describe. I trusted her with my family, and she abused that trust. I can't allow her anywhere near Dylan. Not now. Not ever." When I sat back down, I noticed Dylan watching me, a flicker of relief in his eyes. Then the judge did something unexpected. "I'd like to hear from Dylan," she said. "If he's comfortable speaking, his perspective would be valuable to the court." Dylan froze, his eyes wide. I leaned over and whispered, "You don't have to, bud. Only if you're ready." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I want to," he said quietly. The judge invited him to the stand, and as he walked up, I could see his hands shaking. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "She lied to me," he said, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "She made me think. I don't know. She made me think I had to go along with it, that it was normal, or that I couldn't say no. But it wasn't. It was wrong, and I hated every second of it." Lisa's face paled, and her lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable. "I don't want to see her again," Dylan continued, his voice firm now. "I don't trust her. She hurt me, and she hurt my dad. We just want to move on." When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed moved. "Thank you, Dylan," she said gently. "You've been very brave." As he returned to his seat, I whispered, "I'm proud of you." The hearing ended with the restraining order upheld and the divorce proceedings moving forward. Lisa stormed out of the courtroom without looking at us, her lawyer trailing behind her. It wasn't a victory yet, but it felt like the tide had turned. Dylan and I walked out of that courthouse together, the weight on our shoulders just a little bit lighter. Leaving the courthouse that day felt like taking the first breath after being underwater for too long. The air was crisp, the sun warm on my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Dylan and I walked to the car in silence, but the energy between us had shifted. There was a sense of relief, like we'd crossed a major hurdle together. As we drove home, I glanced over at him. He was staring out the window, his expression calmer than it had been in days. "You did good in there," I said, breaking the silence. He turned to me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks. I needed them to know the truth." "They heard you," I said, loud and clear. When we got home, the house felt different. It wasn't haunted by Lisa's presence anymore. It was just ours. Dylan went to his room while I collapsed onto the couch, finally letting myself relax. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension in my chest eased. The next few weeks were about rebuilding. Lisa stayed away, likely under the advice of her lawyer, and the investigation against her was underway. Frank kept me updated, but I tried to focus on Dylan. He needed normalcy, and I needed to give it to him. I reached out to his school and arranged counseling for him. He was hesitant at first, but after a few sessions, he admitted it was helping. Seeing him open up, even just a little, was enough to give me hope that he'd heal from this. I also made a point to reconnect with him in ways I hadn't before. We went to the movies, grabbed burgers at our favorite diner, and even started shooting hoops in the driveway, a pastime we'd both let slip in recent years. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch watching a game, Dylan turned to me and said, "Thanks for everything, Dad." I blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For not giving up," he said simply. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I'll never give up on you, kid. You're my son." The divorce was finalized 2 months later. Lisa didn't fight it in the end. Maybe she realized how much evidence we had against her. Or maybe she just gave up. Either way, the judge granted me full custody of Dylan, and the restraining order became permanent. I didn't hear from Lisa again, and honestly, I didn't care to. She was a chapter of my life I was ready to close for good. Now, a year later, life feels lighter. Dylan's doing better in school, and he's even started talking about college, something that used to feel like a distant dream. As for me, I've thrown myself into being the best dad I can be. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about everything that happened. The betrayal, the lies, the way it all nearly tore us apart. But instead of dwelling on the pain, I try to focus on what we've gained: a stronger bond, a clearer understanding of what matters, and a second chance at a life without toxic influences. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: family isn't about blood or marriage. It's about the people who stand by you, who fight for you, and who help you rebuild when everything falls apart. Dylan and I are proof that even after the worst storms, it's possible to find calm waters again.